Welcome to week 2. This week we're going to be looking at the origins of agriculture in the Middle East, which is the earliest area in the world that saw the development of agriculture. We're going to be talking about what agriculture actually is. You guys will be reading a little bit and we'll be talking about what a revolution in human history this was. Without the development of agriculture, we wouldn't have the kinds of societies that we see today. You cannot have, as we'll see, large populations and surplus food without agriculture. It's not possible using hunting and gathering. You can support larger populations with intensive hunting and gathering, as we'll see, but you can't support cities with intensive hunting and gathering. Now, this will be an issue that you also explore later in the week when you look at the site of Göbekli Tepe. Okay, so let's talk about some definitions. First, agriculture. What is agriculture? Seems pretty obvious, but agriculture is intensive food production, right? You're actually producing food, not just collecting wild food, which you would do as a hunter and gatherer, using predominantly domesticated species. And we're going to talk about what a domesticated species actually is. Second, Neolithic. Neolithic throughout the world is defined by when agriculture appears. So the Neolithic in China and the Neolithic in Europe and the Neolithic in the Near East are not going to correspond to the same time. When archaeologists feel that agriculture, evidence of agriculture appears in the archaeological record, that's when they draw the line and say, now you're in the Neolithic time period. Cultivation. Cultivation can be done by hunters and gatherers, as we'll see. It doesn't necessarily use domesticated plants and animals, but it is the encouragement of the growth, especially of plants, right? So clearing an area of forest deliberately, because you know that wild plants that you collect will grow there, is a kind of cultivation. Bringing water to feed, let's say, some of these wild plants, is a form of cultivation. So it's an active process. Domestication, we're going to talk some more about this, but domestication is not training a wild animal, it's not taming a wild animal, it is selection of traits to produce new varieties of plants and animals. It's a difference on the genetic level. Okay, sedentary. Sometimes people misinterpret when we say, oh, these hunters and gatherers were sedentary. We use this term very differently today than what we're describing with ancient hunters and gatherers. When we say modern people are sedentary, we say sitting around looking at a computer all day, like I'm doing. That's not sedentary hunters and gatherers. Sedentary hunters and gatherers have a home base. They go from that home base and they collect food and they bring that food back to their home base, rather than being completely mobile and setting up temporary campsites in different areas to use and harvest different foods. And that's what's known as foraging. Foraging is mobile hunting and gathering, as we're going to see. Okay, like many of these big questions, we see kind of an arc in the development of archaeology. At first, for example, the origins of civilization or the origins of agriculture. We start off from a point of not really knowing much about the problem. Intensive field work is done in areas like the Near East. And then you reach a point where enough data has been collected that these kind of big picture thinkers, like you can see here, Ofer Bar Yosef, Israeli archaeologist, and also Israeli archaeologist Anna Belfer-Cohen, working mainly with material collected from the Levant. That's where a lot of intensive work was done. The Levant, in the periods of the development of agriculture, is known better than other areas. Now archaeologists are beginning to work in these areas. But what these big picture thinkers did was they integrated the data together And they came up with kind of an answer to the question of why did agriculture develop in the Middle East at a certain time. And this was from about 1990 to 2010. Their paradigm or their way of thinking was the dominant one. It was supported by most of the evidence. Since that time, work in other areas of the world and work on new excavations has yielded data that seems to conflict with this paradigm. And so, as we're going to see, now we're beginning to change the narrative. We're beginning to add this data and see that maybe they weren't exactly correct. I worked with Annabelle Cohen in a Natufian. We're going to hear about the Natufians today. A Natufian site in Israel that was mainly a butchery site of wild animals. It was kind of like a hunting and butchery site, and it was a very interesting experience. So you definitely have to give these two individuals credit, as well as other people, for integrating the data and trying to come up with a grand scheme. Okay, the Neolithic Revolution. Child, V. Gordon Childe, as we're going to hear about him, came up with this term, the Neolithic Revolution, because he thought this was as big a revolution in human history as the Industrial Revolution. Right? It had a dramatic impact on human history. Okay, a few other things to keep in mind. Terminology. Archaeologists use different terms to describe different things. Right, so, for example, we are going to be talking about large-scale geologic terms. Everyone knows the Jurassic period, the Cenozoic period, the Devonian period. We're going to be mainly talking about the Ice Age, which is the Pleistocene, and the Holocene, which is the geologic period that we are currently in. Although there's some debate, some people think that now we're in a different geologic time period called the Anthropocene, because humans have dramatically changed the climate. We're actually in a different kind of geologic age in terms of temperature and weather patterns. But there's different thinking on that. These geologic ages usually correlate with dramatic changes in the climate. So what we're going to see is that the Ice Age was about 12 degrees colder Fahrenheit than it is today. So it was mostly a cold spell. The Holocene was warmer and wetter. So many people believe that agriculture was only possible in the Holocene because the conditions in the Pleistocene were not good enough. But within the Pleistocene and the Holocene, there are different time periods of the Stone Age, and also different cultures. So it's important not to get too confused when archaeologists use different terms. So let's look at some of the different terms. Okay, so Pleistocene and Holocene are talking about large time periods. Within those time periods, and these geologic time periods, are archaeological periods. Right? So this is not based on climate, and it's not based on global patterns. It's based on the kinds of tools and the kinds of lifestyle that people had. So we have the Old Stone Age, we have the Middle Stone Age, and we have the New Stone Age. As we said before, the New Stone Age is demarcated, the beginning is demarcated when you have agriculture. That could be a little complicated. How do you actually identify when agriculture is actually there and not just the process leading up to agriculture? So that becomes very complicated. Okay, so we've got the Old, the Middle, and the New Stone Age. Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. Now, within those larger periods, we have cultures. Archaeologists around the world will talk about cultures based on the kinds of tools, the kinds of, let me just get back here, sorry. The kinds of tools, that people have, the kinds of architecture, the kinds of houses, material culture. Right? Within the material culture of the Middle East during this time period, we have these mobile hunters and gatherers called the Kabarans, and we have the Natufians, and then we have the Neolithic. Now, archaeologists are not very clever when it comes to naming things, especially things like cultures and time periods. They either call the culture based on the site that it was found at, or based on the kind of pottery they made, or the time period. Right? So in this case, PPN stands for pre-pottery Neolithic, before pottery was invented. And an archaeologist, we're going to talk about Kathleen Kenyon, famous archaeologist who worked at the site of Jericho, divided up the PPN into A and B. So we got PPNA and PPNB. All right, archaeologists also will use different ways to designate time. They might use BP, which means before present or years ago, or they might use BC, which is the calendar date. Now, it's easy to go from BP to BC as long as you just don't confuse them. I've had this problem before where I remember the number. I remember, this site is 10,000, but I don't remember, is it 10,000 years ago or is it 10,000 BC? BC is roughly 2,000 years less than BP, right? So, for example, 23,000 years ago. Well, you go 2,000 years back to the year 1, and then you have 21,000 years left. You go back 21,000 years, you're in 21,000 BC. So to convert from years ago to the date in the calendar, you just subtract 2,000 in general, right? So you're going to see that the sort of end of the Ice Age is around 13,000 years ago. We're going to be talking, the dating is changing now with new work that's being done. Most of the research on the early development of agriculture took place in the Levant. So we have a lot of information from the Levant, and we have more growing information from other areas. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different theories to explain why agriculture occurred, starting with some of the earliest theories. We're going to talk about the dominant explanation from the 1990s till about 2010 that was developed by people like Ofer Bar Yosef. And then we're going to see how the story has changed in light of new research. And you'll also see that in the reading as well. Okay, so what was the Ice Age like? You probably have seen the Ice Age movies with the mastodon and the squirrel that tries to get the nut and all that kind of stuff. We know it was colder. A lot of northern Europe was covered in ice sheets. Canada was covered in glaciers and ice sheets, as well as large parts of Michigan covered in ice. Right? So it was colder and it was drier than it is today. A lot of areas had grassland, shrub. Things were less green than they are today. People hunted in Europe and also in North America. They hunted megafauna like mammoth and mastodon. In Africa, things were better, obviously, and this is where the earliest modern humans developed. Okay, the dominant lifestyle of people all around the world was hunting and gathering, foraging, right? Mobile hunting and gathering. It's hard to figure out exactly what life was like based on the evidence that we have. So sometimes archaeologists will use ethnography as an analogy. So they might try and study recent hunters and gatherers like the Kung. But this is not completely accurate because you can't use it as a one-to-one correlation with ancient hunters and gatherers, because the Kung have not always been hunters and gatherers. They're hunters and gatherers in the desert in South Africa because they were pushed out of territory by Bantu-speaking people moving in that area. They moved into an area where agriculture was not possible, and they were able to live according to hunting and gathering. So there are some things that we can learn from studying people like the Kongsan and other hunters and gatherers, but it's not like a window into the past. These are not Stone Age people. These are modern people using a subsistence strategy that has existed for thousands of years. 99% of human history, the history of modern humans, we were hunters and gatherers. So we were moving around in groups of 20 to 30 people. We were mobile. We would map our migrations to when food was available. We'd build temporary shelters. People could not accumulate much wealth because they had to carry everything with them. There wasn't a lot of stratification between people in terms of hierarchy. People were relatively equal. They couldn't accumulate lots of wealth objects. And also, there was a focus on sharing and a focus on consensus. Right? So it was a very different way of life. And then this started to change with the end of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the Holocene. Right? So about 13,000 years ago, or 11,000 BC, is when the Pleistocene, this is the 1990s to 2010 version, this is when the Pleistocene ends. Right? How do they know this climatic change occurred then? Well, from many different parallel forms of evidence. Oxygen isotopes in deep sea cores and glaciers indicate that the temperature was increasing, and also indicates, because there's increased temperature, the sea levels rise, the ice melts, and if the ocean is warmer, there's more precipitation. So it becomes warmer and also becomes wetter. And you can tell that from pollen data, and you can tell that from the oxygen isotope data. You can actually tell there's more rainfall. So the climate gets much better all over the world. The megafauna disappear in North America. So in the Pleistocene, the Middle East was cooler and drier. And in the Holocene, it starts to get warmer and wetter. And in fact, a lot of areas of the Near East were milder and better than they are today. There are areas of what are now desert in the Middle East that, based on archaeological evidence, we know were much greener and wetter back in the beginning of the Holocene, around, let's say, 11,000 BC. So in the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, we start to see forests of oak and pistachio. And within the forest, we also have medium-sized mammals. We have gazelles and deer and wild donkeys or wild asses, onagers, right? Into areas today that are practically desert. Okay? Now we're going to see that the Middle East had some advantages over other areas of the world. The advantages that the Middle East had were not just this good climate at the beginning of the Holocene, but they had wild resources that were suitable for agriculture, suitable for domestication. Not every area of the world had wheat and barley and chickpeas and lentils and pistachios. Right? Not every area of the world had, within this region, wild pig, wild goat, wild cattle, and wild sheep. The Middle East had the wild ancestors of what become the earliest domesticated animals in this area. Obviously, dogs were already domesticated by hunters and gatherers. But in terms of the Neolithic, in terms of farming, right, the Middle East had these things available. Very suitable crops and animals for domestication. So there's only one area of the world where wild pigs, wild sheep, wild cattle, wild goats overlap in space. That's the Middle East. And as we said before, also these wild cereal grains that are suitable for domestication and extremely nutritious. Okay, so what was the lifestyle of these hunters and gatherers at the end of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the Holocene, right? Well, at the end of the Pleistocene, we have a culture that's called the Kabaran, and then we have a culture called the Natufian that we're going to look at. Both of these cultures are what we would call microlithic cultures. They start to develop the use of very small blades, like you can see here. This is a finger, an index finger, and you can see how small these blades are. They would combine these blades together to make arrows, make harpoons, to make other things, right? So to make sickles, to cut cereal grains. So these little microliths would be put together to make other tools. The way you can tell the Natufian microliths is they are kind of crescent moon shaped. These kinds of microliths are called lunates, kind of after lunar or moon shape, and you can see the kind of moon shaped microlith. So this is very indicative of Natufian culture. So you can kind of see how archaeologists use diagnostic artifacts to correlate with cultures, and then they're able to date sites based on this. Okay, so the Kabarans were mobile hunters and gatherers. The Natufians were living in the Holocene in a climate that was much better, warmer, and weather where there's more food. Because there was more food locally available, the Natufians didn't have to do something as much as the Kabarans. And that, of course, is move. Right? If there's more food locally available and you don't have to move, you're not going to move. Ancient people and people around the world don't move unless they have to. Right? We live in a very strange society where now we actually have to schedule movement into our day because we don't normally get it. But with people who had to move around a lot, and there's, obviously hunters and gatherers, when they become sedentary, they're not just sitting around, they're still working. They just don't have to actually pack up everything and go to the resources further away because they're more closely available. So we have a movement from the foraging Kabaras, right, where they move people to the resources, to what we call the Natufian collectors. They move the resources to the people. They are sedentary, which means, and there's a lot of different changes that occur once you are sedentary. You don't have to move around as much. There are things that you can do, which we will talk about. Right? Okay, so we see that switch from the Kabarans. We can tell from the archaeology that they're mobile. We can see that their shelters are less permanent. We can see that the kinds of foods that they're eating are seasonal at sites. They eat one kind of seasonal food in one site, and a different site they're eating foods of a different season. With the Natufians, we see permanent housing, and we see food from all of the seasons year-round. Okay, why is it called the Natufian? Well, the Natufian culture was first identified by a very well-known British archaeologist, Dorothy Garrod. Here she is here in the middle, in 1928. At this time in the 20s and 30s, most of the archaeology was focused on the historical time periods, the biblical archaeology, and she was a pioneer because she was really looking at prehistoric time, especially this unknown time period before cities. And she discovered the culture near Wadi an-Natuf, and based on that, it was called Natufian. There are different kinds of Natufian sites that were found. Coastal forest sites, areas in the steppe, right, which is more grassland, and also in the desert. There are cave sites, but there are also open air sites. And we can see, as we'll see, that there's permanent occupation, and they are larger than the Kabaran settlements. When you become sedentary, and there's more food, your population will start to increase. More food, more people. Also, being sedentary and not having to move around as much makes it easier to have more children and have a growing population. So, because we see more Natufian sites, and the Natufian sites are larger than the Kabaran sites, right? So two things going on here. There are more Natufian sites than Kabaran sites, and the Natufian sites are larger than Kabaran sites. This allows archaeologists to say that the population overall in the area was increasing. Okay, they did still have seasonal sites, but they had the larger sites were occupied all year round. So they were getting collectors, and they would bring things back to a central location. Okay, so here are some of the Natufian sites. I worked at a Natufian site right near the Sea of Galilee. It was called Nahal Ein Gev. You don't have to remember that. You only have to know a couple of these sites. We're mainly going to talk about this site over here called Malaha. I also visited some of these sites over here on the coast and near Haifa, just south of Haifa, and those were very interesting. Let's see what some of these sites look like. Okay, so a cave site in Hayonim, right? That, you know, again, and this is something you'll see in the reading. Because they're living in caves doesn't necessarily mean that they're somehow very primitive, right? We tend to associate caves with being primitive, but that's not true. These are, you know, rock shelters that are very, very useful. And they would also have open sites as well, right? Here's one that would be in an open valley. Here's one in a more desert-like area, which was warmer and wet. Well, it was weather back in the Natufian period. Right? Okay, so year-round occupation sites. We're going to see how you can tell, again, that they're year-round. Malaha, or it's also called Ainan, is one of the best-known Natufian sites. You have round houses called pit houses. They're dug a little bit into the ground, right? About 9 meters. So we're talking about 27 feet in diameter, lined with stones, with holes that held up the posts to hold up the roof. So something like this, right? So you would have had kind of a circular foundation. You would have had these poles over here and poles kind of in the middle to help support the roof. You would have had maybe a fire in the middle, and that little hole would allow the smoke to go out, but you'd also be sheltered from the environment as well. Stone foundation with probably a little bit of wattle and daub and mud brick and things like that. So this is what Malaha or Ainan might have looked like. All right, so what do you find? You find these round houses with stone foundations, so more permanent. This is, they're investing in structures that are going to last for a long time. We also can see that some of these houses are abandoned and new houses are built on the remains of those houses. The superposition of houses, which again shows that these houses are permanent and that they're living there for long periods of time, long enough so that if a house is abandoned or collapses, they'll build a new one on top of it. These are the kinds of stone-lined holes to support the roof beams that would hold up the roof, as you can see here. So here's a slightly different reconstruction of what one of these houses might have looked like. You would have had, maybe 25 something like people in some of these Natufian sites, or a little bit more. They had storage pits. Mobile hunters and gatherers cannot store food. They can only bring with them what they can carry. So now that they're sedentary, they can store food. Repeated building, as we saw as well. Also, because you're living in a permanent village all year round, things start to build up, like your trash. You throw your trash in your village, you keep living there year after year after year, your trash builds up. What happens? It attracts rodents. So archaeologists have actually found the bones of mice and rats in these permanent villages. Right? These set the stage for what comes next, as we'll see. Okay, here's a stone-lined storage pit. So they would store different things within these pits, and we start to see evidence that they're relying more and more on plants like wheat and barley, lentils, chickpeas, etc. These are the plants that end up becoming very important in the development of agriculture. Right? So you have something called vetch, which is kind of like a lentil. Lentils you can see over here, beans, chickpeas, right? Lupins, and barley. Wheat and barley become some of the most important foods in the Neolithic diet. We can also tell that they were processing these foods based on the tools that they had. These microliths, many of these microliths have very smooth, polished edges on one side. Right? That is, the edges have a shine to them or a sheen. And what that is it comes specifically from their use as sickles. Because as you cut into the stalks of wheat or barley, there are little pieces of silica in the plant cell walls. And silica is, basically sand. So think of it as very fine-grained sandpaper rubbing up against the edge of those blades. And what you're getting is an extremely fine, smooth polish. That's not something that you would get from using these microliths on another kind of substance. So this is sometimes called silica sheen or silica polish. When you have tools, especially stone blades, that have silica sheen or silica polish, you know that they were used to harvest plants, and they were used to harvest many plants. What else do we see? Well, the other part of the process in using wheat and barley is, of course, grinding. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but processing wild wheat and wild barley for food is very labor intensive. You have to go out, you have to harvest the wheat and barley, then you have to remove the seeds, then you have to take off the hull from the seeds, then you have to grind the seeds into something like a dough or a flour. And so we start to see more groundstone tools at these Natufian sites, which again show that they're using these plants intensively. So basalt carved into mortars and pestles, as you can see here, and sometimes they would even dig right into the bedrock and use these as mortars as well.